The hull breach alarm screamed through the training vessel's corridors as Cadet Jake Morrison sprinted toward the bridge. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Something primal. The Krath Predator ship had appeared from nowhere, its weapons tearing through their shields like paper. Around him, senior officers barked orders while the ship's systems flickered and died one by one. Jake slammed into the bridge's blast door just as another impact rocked the vessel. He crashed against the metal, his shoulder erupting in pain. Through the observation window, he saw it. The Krath warship loomed impossibly close, its bioorganic hull pulsing with a sickly green luminescence. Tentacle-like appendages extended from its flanks, wrapping around the human training vessel like a spider securing its prey. Commander Lisa Hayes turned from her station, her face pale. "Morrison, get to an escape pod now." "Ma'am, the engineering deck is compromised," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "No pods on this level are functional." The bridge shuddered as the craft ship's boarding tentacles began burning through the outer hull. Jake could hear the metal screaming, could smell the acrid stench of melting titanium. His instructor, Lieutenant Greg Palmer, was already at the weapons console, but the screen showed nothing but red failure indicators. "They're jamming everything," Palmer said through gritted teeth. "Communications, weapons, navigation. We're dead in space." Another cadet, Amy Chen, stumbled onto the bridge from the starboard entrance. Blood streamed from a cut above her eye. "Sir, they've breached decks 3 and 4. The crew there is gone." Just gone. Jake felt it then. That thing inside him that the psychological evaluators had flagged during his entrance exams, the thing they called a borderline disqualifier. Rage, not the hot-headed anger of youth, but something ancient and territorial, something that made his vision sharpen and his muscles coil with inhuman tension. The Krath were inside the ship now. He could hear their clicking communication, like insects chittering in the walls. The species was known throughout the galaxy as harvesters. They didn't just kill. They consumed. Bodies, technology, memories extracted from dying brains. Humanity had lost 17 vessels to them in the past year alone. Commander Hayes activated the emergency lockdown, sealing the bridge. "We have maybe 5 minutes before they cut through these doors." Jake moved to the emergency weapons locker, his hands no longer shaking. They were steady, too steady. He pulled out a plasma rifle, checked the charge, and grabbed 3 additional power cells. Amy stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Morrison, what are you doing?" she asked. "Buying time," he said simply. Palmer grabbed his arm. "Son, this isn't a simulation. Those things out there have been hunting and killing for 10,000 years. You're a cadet. You've had 6 months of training." Jake met his instructor's eyes, and Palmer actually stepped back. There was something in the young man's gaze that didn't belong to a frightened student. It belonged to something far older. "Sir, with all due respect," Jake said quietly, "they just made a mistake." "What mistake?" Commander Hayes demanded. "They trapped a human." The bridge door began to glow red as the craft started cutting through. Jake chambered around in the plasma rifle and moved toward the door. His heart rate slowed instead of quickened. His breathing became measured and controlled. Every lesson from basic combat training crystallized in his mind, but beneath it all was that burning core of something else. The Krath thought they were predators. They thought wrong. The first section of door fell inward with a crash of superheated metal. Through the gap, Jake saw them. Tall, insectoid creatures with forearms and mandibles that dripped with digestive enzymes. Their exoskeletons gleamed in the emergency lighting, and their compound eyes reflected like shattered mirrors. Jake Morrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. The Krath had hunted across 1,000 worlds. They had consumed species after species, adding biological advantages to their hive's collective strength. They had faced warriors and soldiers and desperate survivors. But they had never faced a human who had stopped being afraid. They had never faced a Wolverine that had been cornered. The lead Krath chittered something that might have been a command or a threat. Jake didn't care which. He raised the plasma rifle and spoke one word that would echo through the ship's failing recorder systems, one word that would later be found in the wreckage and debated by military historians. No. Then he pulled the trigger, and the bridge erupted into chaos. The plasma bolt caught the lead Krath in its thorax, punching clean through the exoskeleton and spraying bioluminescent fluid across the corridor. The creature's screech was inhuman, a sound that should have frozen Jake's blood with terror. Instead, it focused him. He fired again and again, each shot precise and calculated. Two more Krath pushed through the breach, their razor-sharp limbs extended. Jake rolled left, using the command console as cover. A blade carved through the space where he'd been standing, sparking against the deck plating. He came up firing, taking the second Krath in one of its compound eyes. The creature reeled backward, crashing into its companions. "Morrison, fall back!" Commander Hayes shouted, but Jake was already moving forward. This was the part of him the evaluators had worried about. The part that didn't retreat. The part that, when cornered, didn't curl up and die. Humans were persistence hunters by evolution, pack animals who ran their prey into exhaustion. But they were also descended from survivors who learned to fight back against predators that should have wiped them out. Jake kicked the severed piece of door, sending it sliding into the corridor. It collided with another Krath attempting to enter, buying him 2 precious seconds. He used them to switch to full automatic and unleash a sustained burst into the breach. The Krath screamed, a harmonized chorus of rage and pain that resonated through the ship's structure. Behind him, Lieutenant Palmer had armed himself and was providing covering fire. Amy Chen grabbed a rifle from the locker, her hands shaking but her jaw set with determination. Even Commander Hayes had drawn her sidearm. The Krath had thought this would be easy. Another harvest, another ship to strip, another crew to consume. They had not expected resistance like this. Their biology was optimized for ambush predation, for overwhelming force against scattered prey. They were not prepared for humans who fought like cornered animals. Jake emptied his first power cell and ejected it, slamming in a fresh one without breaking his firing rhythm. A Krath limb thrust through the gap, trying to widen the breach. He put 3 bolts into the joint, and the limb fell to the deck, still twitching. The Krath pulled back, their chittering taking on a different tone. Uncertainty. Maybe even fear. Good, Jake thought. Now they know how it feels. The bridge was a fortress, and he was its defender. Every neural pathway in his brain was firing with perfect clarity. He wasn't thinking anymore, not in the traditional sense. He was reacting, adapting, surviving. This was what humanity had always been beneath the veneer of civilization. This was the species that had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain, not through strength or speed, but through sheer stubborn refusal to die. The Krath tried a new tactic, flooding the corridor with a paralytic gas that their biology was immune to. Jake saw the green mist seeping through the breach and immediately fell back, grabbing an emergency respirator from the wall panel. He tossed one to Amy, another to Palmer. "Seal your suits," he barked, his voice muffled through the mask. But the gas was spreading faster than they could compensate. Jake felt his fingers going numb, his legs weakening. The Krath were pushing through now, confident their prey was helpless. He saw 3 of them entering the bridge, their mandibles clicking in what might have been laughter. That rage inside him surged, burning through the chemical paralysis like it was nothing. Jake's body shouldn't have been able to move. The gas was designed to shut down complex nervous systems. But rage was older than nervous systems. It was cellular, mitochondrial, written into the DNA of every survivor species that had ever clawed its way out of the primordial soup. He lunged forward, plasma rifle forgotten, and slammed into the nearest Krath with his bare hands. The creature was twice his size and armored with organic plating that had evolved over millennia. Didn't matter. Jake's fingers found gaps in the exoskeleton and pulled, tore, ripped. The craft shrieked and tried to shake him off, but he held on with a grip that would have shattered human bones. Lieutenant Palmer watched in stunned silence as his cadet, a kid who could barely pass his hand-to-hand combat courses, literally fought an apex predator to a standstill. Amy Chen kept firing, her shots coordinated with Jake's movements, providing openings he exploited with brutal efficiency. The second craft tried to pull Jake off its companion, wrapping a bladed limb around his torso. He felt ribs crack, felt blood filling his mouth. The pain should have stopped him. Instead, it made him angrier. He twisted, using the craft's own grip as leverage, and kicked backward into the third creature's thorax. The impact sent it stumbling into the corridor. Commander Hayes had sealed the remaining blast doors, trapping the three craft inside the bridge with them. It was a desperate move, but it was also strategic. If they were going to die, they'd take as many of these monsters with them as possible. That was the human way. That was the Wolverine way. Jake finally got his hands around the first craft's neural cluster, the biological equivalent of a brain. He squeezed, and the creature went rigid before collapsing. The second craft released him, backing away. Its chittering had changed entirely now. This wasn't the sound of a predator. This was the sound of prey realizing it had made a terrible mistake. The young cadet stood, blood streaming from a dozen wounds, his uniform torn and burning from acid contact. He should have been dead. He should have been paralyzed. He should have been consumed. Instead, he was standing, and he was smiling that terrible smile again. The craft tried to retreat, but the sealed blast door trapped them. Jake picked up the plasma rifle, checked the remaining charge, and advanced. Palmer moved to support him, but Jake held up a hand. "Sir, permission to finish this," he said, his voice raw. Hayes looked at the carnage, at the dead craft, at the cadet who had somehow become something more than human in the heat of combat. She nodded slowly. "Permission granted, Cadet Morrison. What happened next would be classified in the official reports. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists and military strategists for decades. What happened next was a human, cornered and trapped and facing certain death, deciding that if he was going to die, he'd drag the monsters into hell with him. The craft on the bridge died fighting, but they died." Jake used every weapon at his disposal, including parts of their own dead. When it was over, when the emergency lights flickered over the scene, he stood in the center of it all, breathing hard, his eyes slowly coming back into focus. "Morrison," Palmer said carefully, like approaching a wild animal. "You with us?" Jake blinked, looked down at his hands, at the blood and ichor covering them. The rage was receding now, leaving behind exhaustion and pain. He nodded weakly. Yeah, sir." "I'm here." "What the hell was that?" Amy Chen asked, her voice shaking. Commander Hayes was already at the communication console, trying to get a signal out through the jamming. "That was a human being cornered. That was a Wolverine showing these predators what real predation looks like." The ship shuddered again, but this time it was different. The Krath vessel was pulling away, its tentacles retracting from the hull. Through the observation window, they could see it accelerating, fleeing into the black. "They're leaving," Palmer said in disbelief. "They're actually retreating." Hayes nodded slowly. "They lost too many boarding parties. Their doctrine doesn't account for resistance this fierce. They harvest. They don't engage in prolonged combat." Jake collapsed against a console, his adrenaline finally crashing. Amy rushed to his side with a medical kit. As she started treating his wounds, he looked up at Commander Hayes. "Did we win?" he asked. Hayes looked at the dead Krath, at her surviving crew, at the cadet who had saved them all through sheer impossible determination. "We survived, Morrison." "Against the Krath?" "That's the same thing." The training vessel's emergency systems finally managed to punch through the jamming, sending out a distress call. Help would arrive in hours. They just had to hold on until then. As the medical team worked on him, Jake felt that rage finally fully recede. It left behind a hollow feeling, like something had been burned out of him. But there was also a knowledge, cold and certain. If he had to, he could tap into that again. He could become that thing again. The Krath had awakened something in him, something that military recruiters would later recognize and cultivate. Lieutenant Palmer stood over him, looking down with an expression that mixed respect and concern. "The evaluators flagged you for psychological issues, anger management problems." Jake managed a weak smile. "Guess they were right, sir." "No," Palmer said quietly. "They were wrong. What they saw as a flaw is exactly what saved us. They're not angry, Morrison. You're protective. There's a difference." Commander Hayes joined them, her hand resting on Jake's shoulder. "When we get back to base, you're going to have a lot of questions to answer. A lot of people will want to study what happened here." "Will I be discharged?" Jake asked. Hayes shook her head. "Discharged? Son, you just proved that humanity has an edge in this war. You proved that when we're cornered, when we're trapped, when we're facing certain death, we don't fold. We fight. You're not getting discharged. You're getting recruited into something special." The hours that followed were a blur of emergency repairs and medical treatment. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, his body finally registering the full extent of his injuries. Broken ribs, lacerations, acid burns, and a concussion. By all rights, he should have been dead 3 times over. But he wasn't dead. He was alive, and so was his crew. When the rescue ships finally arrived, the crews found a scene they could barely comprehend. A training vessel, dead in space, with a Krath boarding party decimated inside. The bodies told a story of brutal, desperate combat. The survivors told a story of a cadet who refused to die. The military investigators who later examined the bridge's recorder data would play the footage over and over, trying to understand what they were seeing. They would watch Jake Morrison transform from a frightened student into something primal, something fierce, something unstoppable. They would debate whether it was adrenaline, training, or something unique to his psychological profile. But those who were there, those who survived, knew the truth. It wasn't any one thing. It was the sum of everything humanity had ever been. Persistence hunter. Pack animal. Survivor. Fighter. The species that looked at a predator twice its size and decided to swing first. Jake Morrison was loaded onto a medical shuttle, strapped to a stretcher connected to a dozen monitoring devices. As the shuttle pulled away from the damaged training vessel, he looked back through the window at the ship that had almost been his tomb. The hull was scarred and torn, but it was still intact. Like him. Amy Chen sat across from him in the shuttle, her own injuries bandaged. "They're saying you killed 7 Krath by yourself." "7. We killed them," Jake corrected. "All of us. I just got angry." "That wasn't anger," she said quietly. "That was something else." Palmer, sitting nearby with his arm in a sling, leaned forward. "The instructors at the academy talk about the Wolverine protocol. It's theoretical combat doctrine based on humanity's tendency to become more dangerous when cornered. We've never seen it in action before." "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now you heal," Commander Hayes said from the shuttle's cockpit. "Then you train. Really train. Because after today, the Krath are going to know about you, about what you can do. And they're going to want revenge." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the shuttle's engines vibrating through his stretcher. Let them come, he thought. Let them try, because now he knew something about himself, something terrifying and powerful. When pushed to the edge, when trapped and facing extinction, he didn't break. He became something the predators feared. The shuttle docked with the rescue carrier, and Jake was immediately transferred to the medical bay. Doctors and specialists swarmed around him, scanning, analyzing, documenting every injury. But beneath all the physical damage, they found something else. Elevated levels of neurotransmitters that should have killed him, muscle tissue showing microscopic tears that indicated impossible exertion, and a heart that had somehow maintained rhythm through conditions that should have induced cardiac arrest. One doctor, an older woman named Dr. Patricia Cole, pulled up his entrance examination files while he was in surgery. She found the psychological evaluation that had nearly disqualified him. Borderline rage disorder, it said. Excessive territorial response to perceived threats. Difficulty controlling aggressive impulses under stress. She made a note in his file, one that would change the trajectory of his military career forever. Not a disorder, she wrote. Adaptive survival trait. Recommend for specialized combat training. When Jake woke from surgery 3 days later, he found himself in a private medical suite rather than a standard recovery ward. A uniformed officer sat by his bed, reading through a digital tablet. The insignia on his shoulder indicated Special Operations Command. Cadet Morrison, the officer said, setting down the tablet. I'm Colonel Stephen Blake. We need to talk about your future. Jake tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his chest. Sir, I'm just a cadet. I was doing what anyone would do. Blake smiled, but it was a knowing smile. No, son, you did what very few people can do. You accessed something we've theorized about for years but never confirmed. The human capacity to override biological limits through sheer will. I don't understand, sir. The Krath are apex predators. They've been hunting across the galaxy for millennia. They have biological advantages we can't match. Strength, speed, natural armor, chemical weapons. On paper, a single Krath should be able to kill a dozen humans without effort. But I got lucky, Jake said. Luck doesn't explain what happened. Luck doesn't explain how you fought through paralytic gas that should have shut down your nervous system. Luck doesn't explain how you generated enough force to tear through organic armor that's harder than steel. Luck doesn't explain how you survived injuries that killed 3 other crew members. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then what does explain it? Colonel Blake leaned forward. Rage. Pure, focused, directed rage. Not the mindless kind that makes people stupid. The ancient kind that made our ancestors survive when saber-toothed cats hunted them. The kind that makes a mother lift a car off her child. The kind that makes a soldier hold a line against impossible odds. Evaluators didn't understand what they were seeing. They saw a risk. I see a weapon. Humanity's secret weapon in this war. I'm not a weapon, sir. I'm just a person who got angry when monsters tried to kill my friends. Blake nodded approvingly. Exactly. You're a person, not a programmed killing machine, not a cold-blooded soldier. A person who protects his pack. That's what makes you dangerous. That's what makes you valuable. Over the next 2 weeks, as Jake recovered, he received visits from various military officials, intelligence officers who wanted detailed accounts of the Krath boarding tactics, xenobiologists who wanted to understand how he'd killed them so effectively, combat trainers who wanted to study his techniques, and psychologists who wanted to map his mental state during the fight. Amy Chen visited too, now sporting a fading scar above her eye that she wore like a badge of honor. They're making us famous, she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. The crew that survived a Krath harvesting. They're interviewing everyone. How are you handling it? Better than I thought. Nightmares, but nothing I can't manage. You? Jake considered the question carefully. I don't have nightmares about the craft. I have nightmares about not being strong enough next time. Amy studied him with concern. Next time? Jake, you nearly died. You did die twice on the operating table. They're talking about giving you a medical discharge. No, the word came out harder than he intended. No discharge. Those things are still out there. Still hunting. Still killing. Someone has to stop them. So it has to be you? It has to be someone. Might as well be someone who's already proven they can do it. Lieutenant Palmer visited on Jake's final day in the medical suite. The instructor's arm was healed, but there was a new weight in his eyes, the look of someone who'd seen combat up close. Morrison, I owe you my life, Palmer said without preamble. We all do. Commander Hayes put you in for a commendation. Highest honor a cadet can receive. I was just doing my job, sir. Palmer laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Your job was to learn navigation and basic systems operation. Your job was not to single-handedly fight off a craft boarding party. That was something else entirely. What happens to me now? That depends on you. The medical board says you're fit for duty, barely. The psychological board says you're stable, barely. Command says you're too valuable to waste on standard training. They want to fast-track you into special operations. What do you think I should do, sir? Palmer was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the stars beyond. I think you should do what feels right, but I also think you should know what you're signing up for. Special operations means the worst assignments, the missions no one else can handle, the fights no one else can win. They'll use you up, Morrison. They'll point you at the biggest threats and pull the trigger. But they'll let me fight, Jake said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. They'll let you fight. Then that's my answer. Jake was discharged from medical 3 days later with a clean bill of health, or at least as clean as could be expected. His ribs had been reinforced with synthetic bone grafts. His acid burns had been treated with regenerative therapy. His concussion had healed without apparent cognitive damage. Physically, he was as good as new. Mentally, he was changed forever. Colonel Blake met him at the discharge center with a folder full of papers. Cadet Morrison, I'm pleased to inform you that you've been selected for the Wolverine program. It's a new initiative designed to identify and train personnel who demonstrate exceptional combat capabilities under extreme stress. Wolverine program, Jake repeated. Like the animal. Exactly like the animal. Small, fierce, and utterly unstoppable when cornered. We're building a unit of soldiers who embody those traits. You'll be among the first. When do I start? Immediately. Your gear is already packed. Transport leaves in an hour. Jake took the folder, flipped through the pages of training schedules, psychological evaluations, and mission profiles. It was intensive. Brutal. Designed to push candidates beyond their limits and see who broke. He closed the folder and looked Blake in the eye. I won't break, sir. I know you won't. That's why we chose you. The transport ship was a military hauler, stripped down and functional. Jake boarded with a dozen other candidates, all of them wearing the same expression. They'd all seen combat. They'd all survived impossible situations. They'd all tapped into that primal human fury that turned prey into predators. As the ship pulled away from the station, heading toward a classified training facility, Jake looked back at the civilian sectors, at the people going about their lives in blissful ignorance of the horrors lurking in the dark between stars. He was fighting for them now, for their right to remain ignorant, for their right to live without fear. The craft had made a mistake when they trapped his training vessel. They'd awakened something in him, something that couldn't be put back to sleep. And they'd proven to humanity that we had an answer to their predation. We had rage. We had fury. We had the Wolverine inside us all, waiting to be unleashed. The training facility was on a moon orbiting a gas giant in an unnamed system. It was remote, isolated, perfect for the kind of work they'd be doing. As Jake stepped off the transport, he was met by a grizzled sergeant who looked like he'd been through more wars than Jake could count. "Welcome to hell, candidates," the sergeant barked. "I'm Sergeant Victor Kane, and for the next 6 months, I own you. You think you're tough because you survived one fight? I'm going to teach you how to survive 100. Now move." The training was everything Blake had promised, and worse. Physical conditioning that pushed Jake's reinforced body to its absolute limits. Combat drills against simulated craft using the latest intelligence data. Psychological conditioning to help him access and control that rage without losing himself to it. Tactical training that covered everything from ship-to-ship boarding actions to planetary assault operations. Jake excelled not because he was naturally talented, but because he refused to fail. Every time he fell, he got back up. Every time he lost a simulated engagement, he analyzed what went wrong and adapted. Every time the instructors tried to break him, he showed them the Wolverine inside. 6 months later, he graduated at the top of his class. The Wolverine program's first official operative. He was given the rank of lieutenant, skipping several grades based on merit and combat performance. His first assignment was already waiting. The craft had hit another human colony, this time on the frontier world of New Dakota. Standard harvesting operation. But the colonists had managed to get a distress call out before going dark. Fleet Command was organizing a response, but it would take weeks to assemble a proper task force. The Wolverine program could be there in 3 days. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood in the briefing room looking at the holographic display of New Dakota. Population 12,000. Agricultural world, mostly. Families, children, all of them now at the mercy of the craft harvesting fleet. "Your mission," Colonel Blake said, "is to insert onto the planet's surface, locate survivors, and hold position until the main fleet arrives. You'll be outnumbered at least 100 to 1. You'll have limited supplies and no reinforcements. The craft will be actively hunting you." Jake studied the terrain, the settlement layouts, the probable craft landing zones. He was already forming a plan, already seeing the ambush points and fallback positions. "Sir, permission to speak freely," he said. "Granted. We're not going there to hold position. We're going there to make them regret ever setting foot on a human world." Blake smiled that knowing smile again. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." "Dismissed, Lieutenant. Your team is waiting in the hangar." Jake's team consisted of 3 other Wolverine program graduates. Each of them had their own story, their own moment when they'd tapped into that primal fury. Together, they were humanity's answer to the predators of the galaxy. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, explosives expert, who'd held off a craft boarding party with improvised mines after her ship's armory was destroyed. Sergeant Marcus Webb, close combat specialist who'd killed 4 craft with nothing but a broken pipe and pure determination. Corporal Nina Torres, marksman, who'd provided covering fire for evacuation transports while wounded and under sustained assault. They boarded the stealth insertion craft without ceremony. This wasn't a glory mission. This was a message. The craft thought they could harvest humanity at will. The Wolverines were going to teach them otherwise. The craft dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the New Dakota system, running silent and dark. Passive sensors showed the craft harvesting fleet in orbit, 3 heavy cruisers and a dozen support vessels. On the surface, thermal signatures indicated multiple craft ground teams moving through the colony sites. "Survivors?" Jake asked the pilot. "Scattered thermal signatures in the wilderness, maybe 2,000 individuals. The rest are either in craft holding areas or already processed." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Processed. That was the clinical term for what the craft did. Biological breakdown and consumption. The victims were still alive when it started. They screamed the whole time. Jake felt that familiar rage beginning to build, but he controlled it now, channeled it. Saved it for when he'd need it most. Get us to the primary landing zone. We're going hunting. The insertion was clean, a high-altitude drop that put them down in a forested area 5 kilometers from the nearest craft position. The team assembled quickly, checking gear and establishing a tactical network. They moved through the forest like ghosts, using every scrap of training to avoid detection. The first craft patrol they encountered never knew what hit them. Sarah's expertly placed charges turned the forest trail into a kill zone. The explosions tore through the insectoid creatures, their screams echoing through the trees. Before reinforcements could arrive, the Wolverines were gone, melted back into the wilderness. It became a pattern. Strike, kill, vanish. The craft were used to being the hunters, used to their prey running in fear. They didn't know how to handle an enemy that struck back with coordinated precision. They didn't know how to handle humans who fought like cornered animals with nothing left to lose. Over the next 72 hours, Jake's team killed 43 craft soldiers, destroyed 2 supply depots, and freed over 300 colonists. They taught the survivors to fight, to hide, to become predators themselves. The craft orbital command grew increasingly frustrated, diverting more and more resources to hunt down the human guerrillas. But it was the 4th day when everything changed. Jake's team had tracked a craft commander to a fortified position in the colony's main settlement. Intelligence suggested this was the harvesting operations coordinator, the mind behind the entire assault. Taking it out could cripple their entire ground campaign. The fortification was a converted community center, its walls reinforced with bioorganic material that the craft grew like living armor. Guard patrols circled the perimeter and sensor arrays covered all approach vectors. It should have been impenetrable. Jake watched from a rooftop 2 blocks away, his enhanced optics picking out patrol patterns and weak points. Sarah crouched beside him, already calculating explosive yields and placement strategies. Marcus and Nina held positions covering their flanks. "This is suicide," Marcus said over the tactical network. "Even if we get in, we'll never get out." "Then we don't get out," Jake replied simply. "We complete the mission. That's all that matters." "The fleet arrives in 18 hours, Nina countered. "We could wait for support." 18 hours is 18 more hours of colonists being processed. 18 more hours of screams. I didn't come here to wait. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. "I'm with Morrison. We hit them now, we hit them hard, and we make them understand that human worlds are off limits." The plan was desperate and brilliant in equal measure. Sarah would breach the east wall with shaped charges while Nina provided sniper cover from an elevated position. Marcus and Jake would go through the breach, hunting the commander in close quarters, where the craft's size advantage meant nothing. They moved into position as the New Dakota sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood red that felt appropriately ominous. Jake felt that familiar rage building, but this time it was different. Controlled, focused. A tool he wielded rather than a force that wielded him. The Wolverine program had taught him that. Sarah's charges detonated with surgical precision, blowing a hole through the bio-armor and creating a breach large enough for 2 people. Before the craft could react, Jake and Marcus were through, weapons up and scanning for targets. The interior of the community center had been transformed into something alien and horrifying. Organic pods lined the walls, each containing a colonist in various stages of processing. The air stank of digestive enzymes and fear. Jake pushed down the horror, channeled it into action. A craft guard emerged from a side passage, and he put 3 plasma bolts through its thorax before it could raise an alarm. Marcus cleared the right flank while Jake advanced toward the center of the structure where the largest biomass concentration indicated the commander's location. They found it in what used to be the main hall. The craft commander was twice the size of a standard soldier, its carapace adorned with trophies from countless harvests. Around it, technicians worked at living consoles managing the processing operations. The commander's compound eyes swiveled toward the intruders, and it let out a chittering command that was clearly an order to kill. 8 craft soldiers converged on Jake and Marcus from multiple directions. The odds were terrible. The environment was close quarters, negating any chance of tactical retreat. It was exactly the kind of situation that turned soldiers into casualties. But Jake wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a Wolverine. The rage came not as a flood, but as a scalpel, precise and deadly. Jake moved between the craft soldiers like water through cracks, his plasma rifle firing in controlled bursts that found weak points in their armor. When one soldier got too close, he dropped the rifle and used the creature's own momentum to slam it into its companion. Marcus fought back to back with him, their movements synchronized through countless hours of training. The craft commander watched the fight with what might have been growing concern. Its soldiers were dying, killed by prey that should have been easy pickings. It raised one massive limb and brought it crashing down toward Jake. He rolled aside, feeling the impact vibrate through the floor, and came up with a plasma grenade in his hand. "Marcus, clear!" he shouted, then hurled the grenade directly at the commander. The explosion was contained by the bio-armor walls, concentrating its force inward. The craft commander shrieked, its carapace cracked and leaking luminescent fluid. But it wasn't dead. Wounded and enraged, it lunged at Jake with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something its size. Jake didn't retreat. That wasn't what Wolverines did. He charged forward to meet the creature, sliding under its attack and coming up inside its guard. His combat knife, molecular edge and capable of cutting through almost anything, found the gaps in its armor. He struck again and again, targeting nerve clusters and vital organs that xenobiological training had mapped. The commander tried to shake him off, tried to crush him against the walls, tried to tear him apart with its bladed limbs. Each attempt failed. Jake held on with that same impossible grip he'd shown on the training vessel, that same refusal to die that made humans dangerous beyond their physical capabilities. When the commander finally fell, the remaining craft soldiers froze. Their leader was dead, killed by a creature half its size. The psychological impact was devastating. They'd been taught that they were apex predators, that other species were merely food. But here was proof that humans could not only fight back, but win. Jake stood over the commander's corpse, breathing hard, covered in ichor and blood. Through the breach, he could hear Sarah's voice. "Jake, we've got incoming. The Krath are sending everything they have. We need to extract now." "Copy that. Marcus, let's move." But as they turned to leave, Jake saw the pods lining the walls, saw the colonists still trapped inside, still alive, still conscious, still screaming silently as the processing continued. He couldn't leave them. Wouldn't leave them. "Sarah, how many charges do you have left?" "Enough for one more demo." "Why?" "We're bringing the whole structure down. All of it. If we can't save them, we can at least end their suffering." There was a pause on the tactical network. Then Sarah's voice came back, steady and sure. "Setting charges now. You have 3 minutes." Jake and Marcus worked frantically, setting the colonists free from the pods. Many were too far gone, their bodies already breaking down. But some, maybe 30 or 40, could still walk, could still fight. He armed them with weapons taken from dead craft soldiers and pointed them toward the breach. "Run! Don't stop. The fleet is coming. You just have to survive a few more hours." An older man, his face scarred by partial processing, grabbed Jake's arm. "What about you? We're making sure nothing follows you. Now go." The colonists ran, stumbling out into the New Dakota night. Sarah's charges detonated 90 seconds later, bringing the entire structure down in a controlled collapse that buried the processing equipment and remaining craft under tons of rubble. Jake, Marcus, Sarah, and Nina regrouped 3 blocks away, watching the dust cloud rise into the sky. "That's going to bring every craft on the planet down on our position," Nina said matter-of-factly. "Good," Jake replied. "Let them come. We'll show them what happens when you hunt humanity." The craft response was massive and immediate. Ground forces converged on their position from every direction. Orbital bombardment turned nearby buildings into craters. The Wolverines fell back in fighting retreat, using every trick and tactic they'd learned to stay alive. They were outnumbered 50-1. They were outgunned. They were running out of ammunition and time. And they were smiling, because this was what they'd been built for. Not to win through superior firepower or technology, not to survive through caution and careful planning, but to fight, to rage, to show the galaxy that humanity would not go quietly into extinction. Nina took a craft blade through the shoulder but kept firing, her rifle spitting plasma until its power cell ran dry. Marcus fought with nothing but a combat knife and stolen craft weapons, laughing as he killed. Sarah's explosives ran out, so she started using volatile power cells as improvised grenades. And Jake became that thing the evaluators had feared and the military had weaponized. He was the Wolverine unleashed. The craft learned fear that night. Real fear, not the kind that came from facing superior force, but the kind that came from facing something that refused to die. They shot him, stabbed him, burned him with acid, and still he kept coming. His team rallied around him, feeding off his fury, channeling their own rage into deadly efficiency. When the human fleet finally arrived, dropping out of faster-than-light travel with guns already firing, they found a scene that would be documented and analyzed for years. The colony's main settlement was in ruins, but flying above it were the tattered remains of several human flags that the Wolverines had planted. Scattered across the battlefield were the corpses of over 200 craft soldiers, and in the center of it all, standing back to back, were 4 humans who'd held their ground against impossible odds. The craft fleet broke and ran. For the first time in their recorded history, they retreated from a harvesting operation without completing it. The psychological impact rippled through their collective consciousness. Humans were no longer prey. Humans were dangerous. Jake was unconscious when the Fleet Marines reached them, his body finally giving in to the accumulated damage. But he was alive, and so were his teammates. The colonists they'd saved, all 43 of them, were alive. The craft had been driven off. The mission was a success. Admiral Catherine Ross stood over Jake's medical pod as the fleet's medical team worked to stabilize him. She'd read his file, knew his history, understood what the Wolverine program represented. But reading about it and seeing the results were 2 different things. "Will he make it?" she asked the chief medical officer. "He should have been dead a dozen times over. Catastrophic injuries to every major system. Blood loss that should have put him in a coma. But his vitals are already stabilizing. It's like his body refuses to shut down." Ross nodded slowly. "That's what makes them Wolverines. That's what makes them humanity's answer to the predators out there." She placed a hand on the medical pod, feeling the vibration of the life support systems. "Rest, Lieutenant. You've earned it, and when you wake up, we'll need you again. Because this war is just beginning." The craft retreat from New Dakota sent shockwaves through the galactic community. Species that had been terrorized by the harvesters for generations began to hope. If humans could drive them off, maybe others could too. Alliances formed, resistance movements sparked. The balance of power in the galaxy shifted, and at the center of it all was the Wolverine program. Jake Morrison and his team became legends, stories told across 1,000 worlds, the humans who fought a craft harvesting fleet to a standstill, the soldiers who proved that predators could become prey. Jake woke 6 days later in the fleet's medical bay, every nerve in his body screaming. But he was alive. He could move, could think, could fight again when needed. Beside his bed sat Colonel Blake, reading through mission reports. "Welcome back, Lieutenant," Blake said without looking up. "You caused quite a stir. Did we save them? The colonists?" 43 survivors, thanks to you. Another 2,000 we found hiding in the wilderness. The craft processed about 9,000 before we arrived. Could have been worse. Would have been without your intervention. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those numbers. 9,000 dead, processed. Consumed, but 3,000 saved. It had to be enough. The program is expanding, Blake continued. After New Dakota, we have 500 applicants for Wolverine training. Everyone wants to be part of humanity's answer to the craft. You're a hero, Morrison. I'm not a hero. I'm just angry that we have to fight at all. Blake finally looked up, meeting Jake's eyes. That anger is what makes you dangerous. That anger is what makes you valuable. Don't ever lose it. What's next? Physical therapy, 3 weeks minimum. Then you're back on active duty. There are 17 more human colonies under craft threat. We need the Wolverines at every one of them. Jake thought about those colonies, about the families living there, about the children who would be processed if someone didn't stop it. He thought about the rage inside him, that primal fury that made him more than human when it counted. And he thought about the Croth, learning slowly that humanity was not prey to be harvested. 3 weeks, he said. I'll be ready in 2. Blake smiled. That's what I expected. But take the 3, Morrison. You've earned the rest. The war will still be there when you're healed, but Jake knew the truth. The war would always be there. The predators would always hunt. And as long as they did, humanity would need Wolverines, would need soldiers who could tap into that ancient fury, that refusal to die that makes a cornered animal the most dangerous thing in the universe. He was one man, one soldier in a war that spanned the galaxy. But he'd proven something essential. When humanity was trapped, when we were cornered, when we faced extinction, we didn't fold. We didn't surrender. We fought back with everything we had, and sometimes that was enough to make the monsters flee. The craft would return. Other predator species would come. The galaxy was full of dangers that saw humanity as weak, as prey, as victims waiting to be consumed. But they'd learned slowly and painfully the lesson that Jake Morrison had taught them. Humans were not prey. Humans were not victims. Humans were Wolverines, small and fierce and utterly unstoppable when cornered. And the rage that burned in their hearts was older than empires, stronger than fear, and more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. Jake Morrison closed his eyes and let himself rest, knowing that when he woke again, when he was called to fight again, that rage would be waiting, controlled now, channeled, weaponized, a tool to protect his species, his pack, his people. The craft had trapped a cadet on a training vessel and awakened something they couldn't put back to sleep. They'd awakened the Wolverine, and the galaxy would never be the same.